My children.
Now, the legacy of specific games can be a poisoned chalice for any team gearing up for a new entry. Diablo, and certainly in the GOAT of the series Diablo 2, the pressure is on. Not least of which in this fourth entry, not only upgrading the engine significantly, offering drastic visual and technical leaps, it straddles the current and last generation consoles along with the core PC release. Have they kept the devil in the details? Now, due to the sheer number of versions to cover here, this performance review is split into two parts. This one covers the current generation and PC versions, while the other looks at the full suite of last generation consoles and the Steam Deck, and what has been hacked and slashed to make it all fit. Now, from a technical perspective, all versions run on a significantly upgraded engine with some updates over the Diablo 3 base. From the weapon system, looting, algorithmics of the core engine, they all remain pretty much as they were, but updated for this new title. But from the art, rendering and audio and visual side, this is practically a brand new engine, something the team have mentioned in prior interviews. The tagline items are all here over the 2012 Diablo 3 release, which means a day and night cycle, dynamic weather, and modern PBR based materials, which significantly improve the character models, from leather suits, metal swords, stone walls, or blood-soaked stained glass windows. From an upgrade perspective, this stands out both in gameplay and the other big improvement: full real-time cinematics. A game such as Diablo that leans heavily on the atmosphere and story it delivers, these are not only welcome but build on the quality and immersion and the strong impression it has across all platforms. These offer a couple of main benefits not possible until now. Your own character, for one, can now be heavily customized in looks and attire throughout play, will now be correctly represented during these as per your in-game choices. Moreover, the dynamic camera can be zoomed, panned, rotated during simpler conversations and exposition sequences, and then the more grandiose sequences ramp up a few notches higher with the highest level of character, world and visual detail present, complemented with camera cuts, volumetrics, depth of field and more post-processing effects. It is here that we can really appreciate the leaps over Diablo 3, which had none of these elements, instead relying on fixed cameras and pre-rendered cinematics exclusively. Not surprising considering the game is now over 10 years old, but the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions really look older in many ways, demonstrating the big leaps made here, which even include that Diablo 3 PC version. Now, it is here that I repeat myself yet again on the growing demands in games over the past year or so in our performance reviews. VRAM and texture demands are high. At 4K Ultra on my RX 6800, it can fill all of its 16GB of VRAM and even more system RAM, and this is during gameplay and not just in those cinematics. The lowest card here in my 8GB RTX 2070 still offers excellent quality, but really needs to be set at high at best, and this can still result in lower quality MIPS in the game, late loading over the PlayStation 5 and Series X, and higher endowed GPUs, and generally a lower image quality, irrespective of the resolution set. But before we wrap up the upgrades and visuals though, let's take a look at a high point of the title in its performance and image quality.
If you're going to trespass into my home, rifle through my things.
So let's get those resolution counts out of the way. The PC has the option to run FSR2 and DLSS2, and the consoles run, unsurprisingly, FSR2. Both the PlayStation 5 and Series X come out with identical counts on all tested sections, completely fixed, and they come out at 2259 by 1271, which is then reconstructed back using FSR2 to that 4K output, 3840 by 2160. The Series S is unsurprisingly lower, targeting now a reconstructed 1440p, but that comes from a base of 1506 by 847. This results in a softer image overall, but some of this is down to the lower install base and therefore lower textures and assets in the title, but the lower resolution can be noticed at certain points and certainly when zoomed in here, but at normal viewing distance the resolution isn't the biggest delta you'll notice, it's the reduction in other effects and that reduction in texture detail, but overall it's a pretty close match to the Series X and PlayStation 5. and actually one of the better Series S versions we've seen in a while, which is likely down to the fact that this is a cross-generation title at heart.
We must be ever vigilant against sin, brother.
Yes, Reverend Mother.
Let the light of Inarius burn away wickedness. Let not temptation lead you from his holy radiance.
The use of FSR2 really helps sharpen and keep the image stable, and the Series S actually has a better image quality over the Xbox One X version this time, but more on that in the other video. Recall that FSR2 has a cost over the base resolution used, but the reduction on fill rate bandwidth and ALU demands is compensated for by better performance and largely a better image than running at a higher resolution without it, not to mention a saving in memory space. Now, comparing PlayStation 5 to PC at the same 4K FSR2 set to quality, the consoles seem to be closer to balanced, the IQ is almost the same. PC does certainly retain stability and clarity a little more, but at normal viewing distance this is not really visible. Likewise, against PC using DLSS 2 at a 1440p output target, which is a 960p base, we get slightly more aliasing and shimmer, with textures and fine detail being pretty close between them, but DLSS just pips the post here. And this is the same on PC, with DLSS being better overall due to the slow movement and fixed camera. This is actually one of the best examples of reconstruction due to the coherency of pixel data between many frames, something far less likely in first or third person games. And in fact, due to that isometric angle, the camera and the slow movement and coherency, it's the one game that I would recommend above anything off the top of my head where reconstruction is really the best option, certainly to 4K, as it can produce a better image quality than native 4K due to the reconstruction and sharpening passed within FSR2 and DLSS 2. Wrapping up the image quality options on PC, if you have an RTX 4000 card, then you can also have DLSS 3 with frame generation on. I can't test that on this particular card or the ones that I have available, but I'm sure it's still a good solution, and certainly in a title like this it doesn't live or die by its input latency. It could be a viable choice if you want to push above 120 FPS at 4K resolutions. So moving into performance, all of them target 60 FPS. PC can obviously go higher or lower depending on your specification, and all versions, no matter what, run cutscenes at 30 FPS. And I'm sure that's upsetting for some, but aside the sudden drop in frame rate as they start, it's not intrusive as these are all passive and can be skipped if required. PlayStation 5 and Series X are pretty much locked 60 FPS in all my tests, but with such a vast game as Diablo with clans, world bosses, sorceresses, druids, far enough magic and storms galore, which is a part of the game in terms of dynamic weather that can happen mid-battle, it may have some dips below, but expect a solid performing title in most of the action, with some occasional traversal stutter being the only issue that may crop up. Now these are very minor frame skips on Series X, Series S and PlayStation 5, but they can occur from time to time. Now on the PC, these stutters and skips can be more pronounced. Never terrible, but do expect some 100 to 600 millisecond stutters when entering new towns during battles, or when enemies are spawned in and out into the sanctuary. Instantiation issues and memory management issues tend to be most of the performance hiccups I'm seeing in this title across console and PC. From the 8 millisecond times that a 120 FPS output refresh requires, this can feel worse than stutters on a 60 FPS, but they are infrequent. Regarding the 30 FPS cutscenes, they are generally smooth, with the only mild frame drops and skips into 16 milliseconds basically leaping between cuts and other areas. The PS5 is slightly better by 1 or 2 FPS advantage over the Series X, but really it's invisible. Now, although all these cutscenes run at 30 FPS, some of the smaller in-game ones can still run at 60 FPS as a target, and here in this section we can see a small 4 to 5% advantage to the Series X, which across a 5-minute run of match play between the PlayStation 5 and the Series X, the PS5 comes in around 1% below the Series X, making them all but identical in performance. I do suspect that most of the performance issues here center around memory allocation, effectively the refinement and optimization of the game code. They appear to be running a double buffered frame rate, and they're running out of memory often across all hardware, as most of the frame drops I'm seeing here and the skips are likely memory related and nothing to do with GPU or even CPU load, or at least directly. And this really points to the fact there's quite a bit of headroom in here, and that's why the resolution targets have been chosen to get a stable title out the door. Which I commend them for, as it's the right thing to do, and it's a rousing success.
This can't be. I know.
This is repeated with the Series S, getting the same practically locked 60 FPS in gameplay, presents one of the closest matches to the two bigger consoles in recent months, again helped by it being a cross-generation game, and the fact the team have been conservative, correctly so, with the rendering choices across all platforms. The game dips in the same places as the Series X and really offers almost identical performance results, just with cutbacks in other areas covered shortly. The only dips I noted were those in the same real-time cutscenes and cinematics, specifically in those same demanding 60 FPS sections as tested earlier. Outside this though, the frame rate remained as flat as the devil's pulse throughout your gameplay.
I need time to prepare.
In the visual respect, we do have some differences and anomalies, which are likely bugs. There is a lack of light sources, shadow casting ones in some key areas, and it can affect all platforms indeterminately. With the PC menu actually having a dynamic lights option you can toggle between low, medium and high, this can be a performance choice, and therefore it could be a performance choice. However, when the Xbox One S has a dynamic shadow casting light enabled that's missing on the PlayStation 5, as you see here, then it does seem to be a cutback in the wrong direction. Indeed, we also get this the other way around, as here with the Pro having the extra shadow casting lights missing on Series S here. This really stands out as a bug because the missing light source makes this story sequence very hard to make out. We see this in other areas with small bloom and incidental lights cooled on PlayStation 5 and Series X over PC's maximum settings here, which again may be a choice, but I suspect it's actually a gremlin in the works. Something I had a few of with characters disappearing when you talk, along with some other bugs that hit hardest on the last generation machines, but I'll cover that in the other video. From a PC matching perspective, PlayStation 5 and Series X appear to be on the maximum settings, aside those dynamic lights, which may be at high or a bug as noted. Everything else sits closest to the best on PC, including those ultra textures, which you can't really run on 8GB GPUs and possibly even 10GB, leaving geometry, shadows, ambient occlusion, particles, effects and textures all better on PlayStation 5 and Series X over the Series S, which does come close with only these areas of reduction spotted, effectively geometry, textures, shadows and ambient occlusion. Aside this, you'll get the full experience on the S, complete with 60 FPS gameplay. The team appear to have made wise and safe choices in the resolution solutions here, which gives most consoles a great deal of headroom, aside the high GPU demanding cutscenes. As noted, the pixel counts earlier, they're all fixed with no dynamic resolution scaling spotted, so it leaves a good amount of headroom, which might be bemoaned by many of you, but it's a very common and correct choice to ensure a stable launch version, something far from the norm of late, so hats off to Blizzard for delivering that here across all three consoles, a stable and well-performing 60 FPS target. In terms of the PC, it really comes down to the specification you've got, but it still runs exceptionally well even on machines below the Series X and PlayStation 5. My RTX 2070 here, running 1440p DLSS 2 quality, can easily hit close to 120 FPS. Yes, it's certainly not locked, and it can scale right down to 60 FPS and sometimes just below, showing that a locked 120 is likely not possible no matter where you set the resolution and visual quality, but it's still a very good performing title, and it certainly pushes visual quality far higher than previous Diablo games. And it even runs well on older CPUs. My RTX 2070 is paired with a Zen 2700 at 3.8 GHz, and it can still hit 120 FPS and beyond, with the CPU rarely being the reason it doesn't achieve it, in fact, if ever. My RX 6800 can push a little further than this, running 4K easily with FSR 2, again at quality, at 60 FPS pretty much locked, aside those stutters and judders that can crop up from time to time, but 120 FPS is still too high for it even at 1440p. Using that option at native 1440p, it can hold 120 FPS quite often, but it will dip occasionally in heavier battles. As mentioned earlier though, a lot of this is GPU issues. Some of it may be bandwidth, but it does point to the fact there are some issues in the engine because the GPU utilization is not always maxed out, and here with my 5600X CPU, it's far superior than my 2700, and this could run above 120 FPS with no problem at all, so it's never CPU bound. Reducing that down to FSR2, quality mode, again at 1440p, still doesn't fix these dips, with it still dropping into the high and even low 90s at certain points. Again, not all GPU related and certainly not CPU related, but do expect a title that can hover somewhere between the 90s and 120 even on hardware as good as this. And even better CPUs than GPUs may not fix it, and you are still locked to 30 FPS cutscenes even on the very best PC hardware, and sometimes these can show frame pacing issues consistently, which is the reason why we're seeing some of the issues on consoles as well. Again, once you run an unlocked frame rate, you can see some of the jumping and skipping that's happening with the frame delivery here, and this also means that the game can misrepresent its frame rate using something like Riva Tuner, because it shows an output of 120 when actually frames are being dropped, i.e. they're not getting to the front buffer. But stop the presses, just as this video was being finished off, a patch was released to PC which now enables a new option to unlock those cinematics above that 30 FPS limit as expected, and now you can see that it runs at 60 FPS even on lower end GPUs. I will be checking whether consoles also get this update, but this does mitigate some of the judders and stutters, and they are certainly working on those memory allocation issues because performance has subtly improved since the original coverage I had here on day of launch. Ultimately, it's a pretty decent performing title across PC and console alike. Whether you can get to a locked 120 FPS is really going to be determined by high-end hardware, 4080 level, and certainly far faster CPUs, because it can become CPU bound at certain threads, one or dual, certainly in bigger cities such as Kovashad, because it uses that aggressively for its loading and decompression, which is the final part of performance testing, the loading segments. They all come in pretty close to each other from PlayStation 5 Series X and Series S. The Series X is the fastest of the bunch, pointing to the fact they're likely using CPU decompression here and not anything else in the hardware, but they are within 1 second of each other. Even the PC is very close using my older 2700X. But here, upclocking that CPU down from its base of 3.3 to 3.8 GHz, we can see approximately 5 to 6% performance improvement in terms of loading on the same Kovashad level. So this means that CPU requirements are going to be the biggest factor in loading, fast travel, and even performance overall in those bigger, denser cities. Diablo 4 is a solid and well-performing title across all current generation and PC hardware. It scales well, gives a great deal of options, and fundamentally achieves the level of solid performance that these titles require, although it does require an online connection to the Blizzard service at all times, even for single player, which is still not something I'm a fan of. It still is a great title that can be played on its own or much better in clans. The performance across every console and PC is very good, and visual quality has taken a significant step up from Diablo 3, although that is now 11 years old and it really isn't competing with itself, it's competing with its peers, and with titles such as The Ascent really setting the benchmark using Unreal Engine 4, it achieves that level of visual quality and no greater in my opinion. It has the same real-time cinematics with exceptional lighting and material quality, dynamic lights in abundance, and that really sets it apart from many other titles, looking like little figurines at certain points. The visual quality is so good. But it certainly is a cross-generation title, and like The Ascent, it also launches on Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and the more powerful versions of those consoles, and even though there are sacrifices and cutbacks in key areas, it isn't a drastically different game from that. You still don't miss out on much of the title on those older generation machines, but you do get an enhanced and improved experience on current gen and high-end PC, and that is really all you can expect from a title as large and enjoyable as the Diablo series.
And be beautiful in sin.
And that's it for another deep dive into game performance, hardware and PC related comparisons. Remember, if you want to see more Diablo 4 coverage, check out our review and also the last generation version of this performance review, which goes into more detail on the sacrifices made. Anyway, for now I'm out, but keep at IGN Performance Reviews and I'll catch you on the next one.
There is an ominous fog uphill. Mad spirits emerge from it. They'll be here shortly. Are you here to help us ward them off?